Hello and welcome to our webinar on Whole Measures for Community Food Projects. My name is Sarah Lambertson and I'm the Community Food Projects Coordinator for New Entry Sustainable Farming Project. I'll be your host today and our presenter is Jeanette Abi-Nader from City Schoolyard Garden. So just quickly, a little bit about New Entry. We are a nonprofit based in Massachusetts. We do on-the-ground work with farmer training and food access here in Massachusetts. We also do national work, both with incubator farms as well as applicants and grantees of the Community Food Projects Grant Program. We received a training and technical assistance grant to provide this support. So everything that we're able to provide to applicants and grantees is free of charge. If you are an applicant or grantee looking for support, I encourage you to take a look at our website there. We've got a lot of links to other websites as well as documents all geared towards CFP. We also offer one-on-one technical assistance for both grantees and applicants, and that ranges everything from the technical how to do grants.gov all the way through evaluation and more content-focused work. So if you have any questions, please take a look at our website or send me an email. And we are here to help. We also have a lot of recorded webinars. This is our last scheduled webinar for the time being, but several of our past webinars are available. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jeanette.
Thank you, Sarah. Hello, everyone. This is Jeanette Abi-Nader. I'm calling in from Charlottesville, Virginia, and excited to talk to you today about the Whole Measures for Community Food Projects, which is a tool and a process that I worked on for about a decade through the evolution of my time when I was working with the Community Food Security Coalition. Today is, we have about an hour, so we'll do a very quick overview, and I'd like to highlight various aspects, both of what the tool is, how it was developed, the purpose of it, and then the components of it. You will not walk away from this hour with the feeling totally confident in how to use it, but I hope that what you will walk away with is the confidence to know how to engage with it, how to modify the tool in a way that might build capacity in your community for envisioning what a whole food system looks like and how your work can intersect with that. So we're going to talk a little bit of history and then break apart the tool itself and then have time at the end for questions. So just to start off, let me get used. There we go. First of all, I wanted to thank the Community Food Security Coalition, which is no longer an organization, but who for several years provided the training and capacity building function that Sarah is working on now, and really excited to see that work continue. The USDA Community Food Projects Program, of course, envisioned this project for providing evaluation capacity for grantees and potential grantees and invested funds in it over the years. The Whole Measures tool that Sarah sent the link to everyone was built off of a tool designed by the Center for Whole Communities called Whole Measures Transforming Our Vision for Success. And this tool was designed by land trust organizations who were really interested in expanding the way they looked at the value of a land trust. So rather than just saying these are the number of acres we're preserving, they wanted to ask questions like how are these acres that we're preserving impacting the communities around which they are? And so they began to design this process, and they brought several different people in from various fields, all connected to land and people, to ask that question about how land affects their lives. And so they developed this tool, Whole Measures. Had invited me in as part of that process from a community food security perspective, and along with other peers in the community, Hank Herrera and the director of the food project at the time, Pat, we all thought this would be a great tool to have for community food systems in particular, as grantees were looking for ways to define their work beyond just the calculating of what they did. So that's a great resource. So we're going to start off, and I apologize, I'm recovering from a cold, so my voice might go in and out, by asking the question, what matters most? So in many evaluation or planning projects, you want to start with that thing that matters the most to you and your community. And we're going to try this exercise. Sarah's going to help me out. Looking at these pictures that you see here on the screen, they're just random various photos. Think about your work and what is essential about the work that you do. And pick a photo that captures what is essential about your work, and you'll see they're numbered on the corner. So just in your mind, look at these pictures, select a picture that captures what's essential about your work, and then in a short phrase, go ahead and type into the comment box for the public, for everyone, a few words that describe that. So for example, most recently when I did this exercise, I picked number 2, and my thoughts around that were people linking together to create something beautiful and meaningful. So I'm just going to take a minute to see if Sarah, Sarah, to let you know, I'm having little problems with my screen in terms of being able to see the chat. There we go.
Oh, you got it now?
It's back now, yeah. Are you all still seeing the vision? There we go. I think it might be best there if you keep the presentation. It went off on my screen here.
Okay. All right. Just let me know when you want me to advance.
Okay. So I'm not sure what screen, oh, there we go. So can you all see that screen now? Or
so, Jen, I think we've got folks entering both in the chat as well as the polling, which I think is fine. But we'll just give maybe a few more seconds for people to enter their thoughts in. All right.
Sarah, do you mind summarizing a few things that people typed in?
No, I'm having a problem with the polling. Are you able to see? I see the chatting is all coming in just to me. Got it. So number 4, mosaic of resources to help community development. Number 1, our work is all about access to healthy, nutritious food and empowerment around nutritional and personal health. People linking together to make something beautiful. Number 8, trust and support. Number 8, improving family health and reclaiming traditional gardening knowledge. Those are the ones that came in through the chat, and I apologize, I'm having a problem with the polling.
That's okay, that's great. It's more just to get an example of how connecting through imagery, through a photo or a picture with what you value most is really what Whole Measures is about. That's one of the exercises that we often use to launch a Whole Measures planning process, because what it's doing is allowing you to think beyond the activities that you're doing, the lists of tasks that you have, the jobs to, what kind of impact do you really want to have, what matters. And so Whole Measures was founded on that principle, that we want to start with those values and then find ways to not only measure them, but to also create programs. So the next slide, please. Can you move forward the next slide?
Yep, sorry, just a moment, just having a brief technical issue. I apologize. It looks like actually one of the participants has somehow taken the presenter.
Oh, Bonnie's taken. Okay, I'll take it back.
Well,
we have to close the poll first.
Yep, and now that Bonnie's the presenter, I apologize, everybody.
How many folks were you working with? What kind of impact? How much food were you growing? That kind of thing. And grantees said, we really want to find a way. The CFP program asks you to have complex multi-sector solutions. So how can we find an evaluation tool that addresses those things? And so that's the purpose of this. The goal is to elevate and inform dialogue about the central values that truly matter, and then develop a shared vision on how you might measure those values. So next slide, please. How it was developed, as I mentioned, it came out of the USDA's request, desire to have grantees have a common way of reporting. There were several hundred grantees that participated over the years in the development of this tool. So we did various surveys and outreach to find out what people were measuring, what were some of the core areas, grouping them into categories, and then working with a core group of about 8 to 10 practitioners to develop a tool that was completed in 2009 and then pilot tested in 2010 and 11. The stories from the field document that Sarah sent out captures some of those stories of the groups that did intensive pilot testing, and I really encourage you to read that because it brings to life how people in various ways took the same tool and modified it to use in their own way. And then it became a tool by which USDA could collaboratively report against their outputs. The next slide speaks to the 3 core ways that we found that people were using whole measures for community food systems. So even though it was developed as an evaluation tool, it's been most often used as a strategic planning tool or a community and project planning for groups to come together and say, we want to have a shared vision of how our work impacts our community, not just beyond the specific program implementation, but on a broader sense. And then also used for evaluation. And throughout each of these 3 strains, community engagement has been a core component of it. The next slide looks at the overview of what's in whole measures for community food systems. First of all, it starts with 6 core value-based fields. And these are sort of words that we use to define categories. And we're going to go through each of those 6. They are justice and fairness, strong communities, vibrant farms. We'll look at them in a minute. There's a section that looks at steps for implementation, and these again are guidelines. They're just a recommendation for one way that you might implement the whole measures. There's a rubric, which is a table that's used for evaluation measures. So many groups have used the rubric in very many different ways. Some organizations will use it solely as a scoring tool, like you might at a school, where you define different targets, and each target has a score. Where you then come up with a quantitative result. Others have used it to describe the story of their work. There's a glossary that talks about the terms. As any of you who do evaluation know, there are so many different ways to talk about an outcome, an objective, a goal, value-based fields, so we included some of that, and then some discussion guides. One of the things we realized when we were pilot testing the tool is that they required a certain set of skills to utilize this kind of tool that was a little bit different than traditional evaluation. And so what are some of those? And so we're just going to look at these briefly at each of these 5 areas in the tool. The next slide looks at the 6 core value-based fields of practice. So in all of our conversations with a couple hundred grantees, we were able to sort of narrow down into 6 core categories what constitutes a healthy community food system. Justice and fairness, strong communities, vibrant farms, healthy people, sustainable ecosystems, and thriving local economies. So one of the exercises we normally do when we're working with a group who's doing this is we do that initial exercise with the photos where we talk about what our values are. People share what their values are, you write them down, and then you think about, okay, how is that value, does it fit into one of these fields of practice? So for example, one of the, let me look at the chat, see if there are any of the comments in there. There was one about respect and trust. That might be evident in a strong community. There was one about healthy food for all. That might be evident in healthy people or vibrant farms. So thinking about the things that you value and the strategies to which you might use, the practices that you might use to get there. If any of you have a hard copy of the tool, if you printed it out or if you have it open on your computer, I'd encourage you to go to the back of the tool where it lists each of these 6 fields of practice. And then the next slide, under each field of practice, so I just pulled out thriving local economies, for example. There are 4 sample practices. So how do we build thriving local economies? By creating local jobs and building long-term economic vitality within the community. Thriving local economies builds local wealth. Thriving local economies promote sustainable development while strengthening local food systems. So these are all, after speaking with many people and asking them, how do you build a thriving local economy? These are 4 examples of what came to the top. And The next slide looks at examples of how you might measure those. So I pulled out one of those practices, builds local wealth, and these are some sample outcomes that you might measure. Are you ensuring that decisions about local economies are directed by members of the community? Are you building economic literacy to sustain long-term economic sustainability? So this is just one example of how we can take each of these 6 core fields and break them into practices and outcomes that can then be measured. And you know, if we had a weekend where we were diving into this, we would spend more time thinking about what each of those are. And as groups, we encourage folks to, some groups that have used the tool use the language that's right here. They'll look at strong communities and they'll say, are we improving equity and responding to community food needs? Are we building a diverse and collaborative relationships? They'll take these. And others will say, we want to define for ourselves what is a strong community and how we're going to measure that. And so they'll, through this collaborative process, say, how do we build a strong community? And then how are we going to measure that? So these 6 practices are really the core of what we're doing. So we're going to try another poll if we can. And Sarah, do you think it's okay to go ahead and try it?
We can certainly give it a shot.
Okay. I thought it would be interesting to see, just from initial flush, I know you're just seeing this, but as you look at these 6 fields, which of the fields does your work engage with? We know that not every project is unique and specific to their community. And so it's interesting to sort of see, we're really strong, we really focus on healthy people, we don't do that much with economy, or we do most all of these, but we haven't yet addressed justice and fairness. We don't have a clear equity lens through which we see our work. So that's another thing that we encourage organizations to do at the beginning. So if you're able to, think of the 6 fields and check off the ones that your work engages with. And let's see what that looks like.
We've got a lot of folks answering.
Okay.
It's like a couple more still coming in, but we're getting close to everybody.
As you're doing that, also see if there's anything that strikes you as missing. Maybe you do some work that's not expressed here, or it just doesn't seem like it fits in one of these categories, and that's an important thing to note too. Always ask that question as you're going through.
All right, we'll give you another 10 or 15 seconds or so.
Are you able to see the results
right away,
Sarah?
Yeah, I'm going to close it and share.
Oh, there we go. Okay, this is great. This is so cool that they have it right away. So a lot of us are working on healthy people and strong communities, which makes a lot of sense. This is community food systems. The justice and fairness and is the weakest in terms, and thriving. Oh, hold on, these aren't in order. So sustainable ecosystems is the lowest one in terms of our investing our energies towards that. And justice and fairness and thriving local economies are down there as well. So the numbers, the percentages are less important than just that, to make the point that community food projects, community food systems are definitely diverse and across the board. And if anyone wants to comment in the chat box if there was anything that you found was missing, I'd be very interested in seeing that, and just make sure that you present everyone, that you select everyone when you type in your comments. Okay, next slide. Thank you, Sarah. So in the Whole Measures for Community Food System, it talks about some recommended steps for implementation. And as later on when I share samples of how groups have used this, you'll see that they use these steps in varying degrees. So first of all, forming an evaluation team or a planning team. This kind of work is intended to be collaborative, and so having stakeholders and partners there, from the participants, from the people that it impacts, to various levels of your community is critically important. And that's the first one. Understanding the rubrics, and we'll look at this a little bit closer, so I'll just leave it at that. Defining and intending the outcomes. So as many of you know, when you write grants or reach out, how you define your outcome is really important. And we found that working with participants to define outcomes that are meaningful to them to all of us, to our community, helps our programs be stronger. So when we all work together towards goals. So there's some ideas about how to do that. Those first 3 steps are really often ideally done at the beginning of a project or before a project is even defined so that you're strategizing together. And then the last 3 focus more on, okay, you've done the project or you've worked through the program and you're either midway through or you're finished and you're going to take some time to reflect on that. So a process that many groups have used is to start by individually rating them. So going through your rubric for healthy people and saying, how did we do? You know, how are we there? And rating for yourself. Then coming together so that you have time to reflect and make sure that your own thoughts are heard and articulated. Then meeting as a group and sharing your various reflections and seeing where there's alignment, where there's differences, things that you might not have thought of. And then utilizing those results within your community to change or to impact your program. The next slide talks specifically about the rubric, which I think it's helpful to spend some time. If you have the document with you or open and you're able to turn to page 20 and 21, or any one of the pages, a rubric, again, it's like a table. It has on the left side, it lists the various, each of the 4 practices and then the outcomes under that. And then it has a rating thing. And to be quite honest, in the 5 or 6, 7 years that I've used Whole Measures, I've never used the ratings. I've always used it just sort of as a, or I've rarely used the ratings, I should say. I've used it more as a way to just sort of think about how well we've done. But this is one way to do it, that you have these different ratings. Another, the original Whole Measures, if you go to that link by the Center for Whole Communities, they have stories in each of the boxes. So underneath, I'll just use the example of strong communities, improves equity and responds to community food needs. The first one involves a broad range of community members in defining and supporting food-related goals. So a negative impact of that might be no community members are involved. The government defines, our state or one person defines what the food-related goals are. That might be a negative impact. A neutral impact might be that, you know, goals aren't even defined. Some impact might be that, you know, organizational leaders are involved in planning the food goals. A stronger impact would be that organization and community members are involved. The highest impact might be, you know, people from various sectors, growers, eaters, consumers, organizational leaders, groceries, all of that are involved. So you might want to describe what each of those on the continuum look like beforehand, and then you're able to select them. I'm going to pause for a second and just see if there are any questions, because that's sort of a lot to explain. And again, please select everyone when you type in your question in the chat. Okay, I don't see any questions coming up to you, Sarah.
Looks like one just came in. It came in to me. Once you have mapped your outcome, how does this method help you measure them? Many of the outcomes listed are really hard to measure, especially with projects that are 1 year or shorter. It might be important to recommend organizations who use this method also use quantifiable, measurable indicators to measure success with regards to these outcomes.
Yes, I'm so glad you asked that question. Who was that from?
Just one moment. Eugenia.
Okay, thank you, Eugenia. So what I forgot to mention at the beginning is that before the Whole Measures tool was developed, we had developed a whole handbook and toolkit, an evaluation handbook and toolkit for Community Food Project grantees, which we can send you the link for. And in the toolkit includes a bunch of traditional evaluation measures, so surveys. So you still have to figure out how to ask that question, just like Eugenia said. You still have to measure, are students getting an impact? So for example, I spent the morning reviewing our evaluation results from a Harvest of the Month program that we're doing at the schools. So there were, students were interviewed. We a selection of students were interviewed. We handed out surveys to all students to find out if this program made a difference in whether or not they liked the vegetables that we profiled, if they learned anything about it. So you use those other evaluation tools to give you the data and the specifics, and then they're placed within this process. So you're able to answer the question as to whether or not you've included a broad range or you've had impact on the students because of the other evaluation tool. So you definitely need to create tools. And we will send you the link to that those two documents, they're very big binders. The toolkit actually includes over 75 different sample surveys that you might use for various farm-to-school programs, farmers markets, youth development, various community food project type programs. Any other questions?
Just a question about the name of the toolkit.
Why it was named Whole Measures?
Oh no, I think they're just looking for specifically what the name is. It's just the Whole Measures toolkit.
Oh, the other toolkit. I'm sorry. It's called the Community Food Project Evaluation Toolkit. And it should be on the USDA website. It's on the Why Hunger Food Security Learning Center's website. Grantees used to receive a copy at the beginning of whenever their grant was awarded, they used to receive a copy of the toolkit and the evaluation handbook.
And I think we have it as well. Yeah, we can make sure. We've got it on our website. We'll make sure to send it.
Okay, we'll move forward, and then we'll ask more questions at the end. So the next slide talks about the discussion guide. And again, I'm just going to highlight these. We really don't have time to have any meaningful conversation about them. But one of the things we found out is that in order to have this process, so if you're going to bring diverse people together and have a conversation about what matters to you, it's important to have a certain sort of set of skills. So the first one speaks a little bit to facilitation, discussion guideline. How do you invest in conversations? What's the process that you use to do that? And the same with the values discussion guide. The third one helps look at how you define intended outcomes and how you might go through that process together as a community. And the evaluation handbook has a whole chapter, I think it's chapter 4, is committed to, how do you define a good outcome, which is also really helpful to do before you write a grant. And the Community Food Project grant asks for logic models often in the application process. So there's a whole chapter in the handbook as well around logic model development. And then there's the evaluation discussion guide and how you might debrief on the results. So those are all tools that you can use in the handbook just to help you engage with your community or your evaluation team. So the next slide, I'm going to switch gears a little bit and just share a few examples about how Whole Measures was used during these pilot projects. And again, I'll give you a brief highlight. I encourage you to read stories from the field. It's inspiring, and it includes pictures, and it includes the words from the folks themselves who did it. And these are the various ways that it was used. So the next slide introduces Nuestras Raíces, who utilized, through the leadership of Diego and Garita, utilized Whole Measures in their youth, with their youth team through a photo voice project. So the next slide shows, these are some of the youth. Diego's there on the right in the green shirt with some youth developing their project, and you'll see on the floor in this one picture. So they went out into the community. They took a month, and they worked on each field for one. Actually, I'm sorry, I can't remember if it was a week or a month. I think it was a month. They focused on each field. So they would start with healthy people. And from the start, the youth were like, this doesn't make any sense. What's vibrant farm? Or they didn't like the language of the tool. I'll say that right off the bat. And so they made it meaningful to them from the beginning. And so they asked the question, what does healthy people look like in our neighborhood? And they gave the students cameras. They went out into their neighborhood and they took pictures, both of what healthy people and not in places where it wasn't, where it was the opposite of that. And they actually had a lot of examples. So they took time. They went through this process. You'll see this poster here is a picture of some beautiful healthy food that was growing at some gardens. Then they talked about ways that they could improve health for people in their community. And they did this for each of the 6 fields. They came up with a set of recommendations and then presented their recommendations to the city council in terms of, this is our youth voice, this is what the youth want to see towards development of a community food system. So that's a very short highlight of how this group did this really innovative and dynamic project. And it was great to hear the youth speak to how engaging in this project built their confidence, built their understanding of their community, helped them feel more connected to the community in a broader way. It was a very effective program, which I imagine they're still using to some degree. So the next slide talks about the Community Food Security Coalition as an organization. So, and you can go to the next slide again. This was a very different use. So you may know the Community Food Security Coalition was a national nonprofit organization that helped launch the Community Food Projects Grants Program. And they provided support to organizations around the country. So while they weren't in a specific community, they were doing food system work. So when we looked at this tool, when we thought, are we building strong communities, our community was the field of nonprofits around the country doing this kind of work. So it wasn't a particular neighborhood, but it was the community in which we worked. And we used the tool to define this strategic frame. So this became the roadmap for how we look at our work moving forward. It helped us fine-tune what our desired impact was, which was a strong community food security movement, the strategies that we use for that. This is like a typical theory of change evaluation framework, and then in purple, the ways that we'll measure that. So a very different use than this sort of grassroots youth using this tool. This was more organizational leaders and members from all around the country defining for this national organization how we want to work. The next slide talks about a really interesting project which has been replicated in a couple different areas that the Sustainable South Sound community used, and they used Whole Measures to structure their community food summit. So it was in connection with the university there. T.J. Johnson was the leader at the time. And so what he did is they created a food summit based on these 6 fields. And so they brought together people from all around their community, and they said, these are 6 ways that we can impact our food system. And they used those 6 fields to define a vision for their broad community. So people over the course of 3 days engaged in defining what does a vibrant food, what do healthy people look like? What does thriving local economies look like? What do vibrant farms look like for us? And what are some of the initiatives that are currently happening in our community towards those things? And what are some of the gaps? What are we missing? And they did this several years in a row. So the first year they did it as a brainstorming exercise, then they used it to create a plan, and then they used it to evaluate. And in the stories from the field, there's a few other groups, a group in Florida that also used a similar model. Oh, I'm sorry, you can go to the next slide. It shows the picture of them presenting on it and some different pictures at the conference, at the summit where they were talking about it. And you'll see one of the brainstorm report back items on sustainable ecosystems. They're up in Washington, and fisheries are a big part of that. So weaving that language in there is another way that it can be used. Okay, the next slide speaks to what this presentation is from, the Community Food Project Indicators of Success. So as Sarah mentioned, USDA helped develop this tool so that they could use it as a way to evaluate the impact that the 80 or so grantees that are funded every year, I mean, I think there's that are active every year, so maybe they grant between 40 and 50 organizations a year, and then there are some that are multi-year, so that they could somehow pull together, and you can go to the next slide, pull together all of the impact that these different organizations were having and be able to say, this is what the USDA Community Food Project monies are doing. So this is the logic model that the Community Food Project program used. It talks about the resources needed, the strategies that are used, and then the outcomes along these 6 fields. And they took this report, and then the next slide, we can go back to this in a minute, but the next slide speaks to some generalized numbers. Like, so these are the quantitative things that they pulled out of it. So grantees, if you're a grantee, you already know, you will learn that you have an online reporting system that captures, okay, collectively in fiscal year 2011, all of the grantees produced 847,000 pounds of produce. So they had a way to report, and that supports healthy people. So not only are they reporting a number, but they're making a connection between that number and a field of practice that's connected to a value. So I'm just going to wait a second and let that sink in, and maybe we can, in a minute, go back to the other slide with the logic model just so you could look at those two. And Sarah, do you want to comment at all on how that's active now?
Sure, yeah, I was just going to jump in. So you can see this ends fiscal year 2011, so it hasn't been done since then until now. I'm just this week going to release the fiscal year 2014 Indicators of Success report, really pulling a lot of the work that Community Food Security Coalition was doing. I tried to keep the format as similar as possible, even though there's been this 3-year gap. So when I send out the feedback form and the recorded webinar and all the tools to all of you, I'll send out that brand new document as well, and so you can see this sort of in action current version of the fiscal year 2014 CFP grantees.
Okay, thanks. So the next slide speaks to our last example, which is at the food project. So the food project used it for evaluation. It wasn't, they used it to help, so the food project was donated these old greenhouses. I think they had previously been a nursery, these very large greenhouses, and they wanted to use them for community food projects. They thought they could have incubator programs that could use, where individuals could go in and use space in the greenhouse for their own sort of micro-enterprise. And so they used the Whole Measures tool to help to create the request for applications from the community members. So they asked community members, describe your program. How does your program support justice and fairness? How does your program support vibrant farms? How does it support sustainable ecosystems? Each of the 6 fields. And then that was the criteria through which they used the selection process in deciding which community members could use the greenhouse space, and then in reflecting with those community members at the end of the year how well they met their targets. So they used it in a very different and unique way as well. And this is at one of their, this is at the very beginning of their project. This picture's a few years old now, when they first started to use it. So those are, that's a quick overview of the stories of the field. And then the next several slides are some workshops, some tools that you could use. And again, this is like, normally we would, take time to, the training for the Whole Measures for Community Food Systems was like a 3-day training. So, but these are some tools I just wanted to share with you all in case you decided to engage in a process. And these are tools, worksheets that Sarah will share with everyone that you can use to begin to engage in this process. So this one is defining your project scope. Thinking about how will you use, you can go back one to, how will you use Whole Measures and what is your overarching purpose? Will you modify it? Will you use the one that's there? Like how in-depth people who want to just implement it right away might use it as it is. Folks who want to, who building the tool itself is part of their program will take more time to define that. Who are going to be on your evaluation team and what are the roles? What will your process be? So that's just sort of one way of beginning to define how you'll use the project. The next slide, workshop 2, is defining the fields. Will you use the definitions and the fields and practices that are here? Will you, what resonates, what doesn't? And one question that we often get is, do we have to use all 6 fields? We only work with farmers, and so we just want to focus on the vibrant farms. And what we found is that we really, in asking that question of ourselves and of the groups that pilot tested it and other folks, it's very important to hold the whole vision, even if your work isn't really strong towards sustainable ecosystems. Maybe you're not really focused on those things right now, but it's very helpful to have an analysis of how you affect the whole system so that your work could grow to be more complex and holistic. So that one can help that process, and then you can use this tool to think, okay, this is our field, our practice, and our outcomes. And when we've worked with groups, we've had, usually what you do is you have like a large brainstorming process where many people provide comments, and then we winnow them down into the themes that emerge, the consistent themes that emerge. The next slide looks at workshop 4, which thinks this is a little bit different, but it thinks about the core capacities. So this is a short list. In the years that we worked with groups, these are some of the things that people said are important skills and characteristics to have when working with this kind of community-engaged evaluation process. It's important to act with justice and fairness. It's important to embody transformational leadership. And the Institute for Social Change is an organization that has taken the Whole Measures tool and developed a very in-depth training around what that means. And they look deeply at transformational leadership. How familiar are you with designing collaborative processes, et cetera? Cultivating storytelling, which is an important part of capturing the impacts. So looking at these capacities, where you individually in your organization is at, and then creating a plan for how you might grow in certain areas is another good step to start with, and one of the things that groups have encouraged. And then the next workshop just looks at the rubric itself, in terms of filling it in and how you're going to use that tool. The next slide, I want to speak just a little bit to ideas for engaging communities. So as groups started to work with this, a lot of questions came up about, it takes a lot more time to engage community. And so deciding from the beginning how much you want this to be a participatory process and if it like reflects your programming, if it supports your programming, if it helps meet your overall mission and goals, it's a very good thing to do. And where is that balance? So some ways that groups have found of doing this is starting with a gallery walk, which is what we started with a little bit today, where say if you were to do a photos as metaphors exercise like we did at the beginning, have people identify their values, but then take that a step further and have each of the fields written up on the wall and have people take time to visit each of those and say, this is how we do this, and looking at each of the ways that you contribute to each of the fields. The Food Summit Framework is another example. The Photo Voice project. Gathering in a neighborhood space was one of the things that people said, when you're having these conversations, doing it in the neighborhoods, in the gardens, having trained the trainers. So not only is the staff from the organization coming out to the community and saying, what do you think contributes to healthy people, but training people in the community that then can go out to their peers and neighbors and ask that question and have that conversation, were all suggestions. And then the next slide just looks at a little bit of a longer list than the workshop 4 above in terms of some of the capacities for whole measures. And I'm just going to let you look at that for a second in terms of practices. Okay, the next slide just shows a picture of some of the ways whenever we've had whole measures trainings in the past, we've asked people to bring an item that reflects one of these fields, and this is one of our tables that included different representations of justice and fairness, strong communities, healthy people, vibrant farms, sustainable ecosystems, and thriving local economies. So I think that's a good place to stop and see if there are any questions. And if you, and we can go back if you want to leave it on the photo slide just as a thing. If there are any questions that you can post to everyone, I'll be able to see it, and otherwise, Sarah, feel free to chime in.
Yeah, we did have one question come in, wondering what the name of the group was in Florida that did the community summit.
Let me look it up. It was Mario. It'll just take me a second to remember.
Sure, yeah,
it's in
fine.
the Stories from the Field.
Right.
Document.
And then the handbook and toolkit are called the Community Food Projects Evaluation Handbook and Community Food Projects Evaluation Toolkit, correct?
Yes.
Okay, yep. And Jeanette said this as she was presenting, but we'll make sure to send those along with a lot of the other documents that Jeanette mentioned. Another question come in, how were the rating scale numbers determined? So
thank you for asking that question. We built this off of the original whole measures. They had a much, this was their model in terms of how the negative impact, the same, strong, and highest. And groups who have used it, you can modify that. You can just use a 1, 2, 3, 4 number. But this was the tool that they used, and so we thought we would try that. I don't exactly know what system they used to determine it. But as I mentioned, I hadn't really used that scoring tool too much to have very much. And again, you can modify it in whatever way works best for the way that you're thinking about it.
All right, and another question, wondering how long some of these projects took.
Yes, so the pilot projects that you'll read about in Stories from the Field were, it was between 12 and 18 months. But not all groups, again, have to use that level. So there was a group in California that used it as a way to evaluate how they had a community grocer, and they wanted to see, they were selling it and wanted to see what community group might use it. So they did a very it wasn't a community engagement process, but they just used whole measures to define the criteria. They put out a call for proposals, and it was a very short process. So depending on the level of engagement and the process by which you're using, will determine the amount of time. Any evaluation project, I think, takes at least a 3-month time to really think through, to form your team, create goals, for the planning stage, and then having the evaluation happen after would add to that. I apologize, Sarah, I can't see the questions.
No, that's fine. They're coming in privately. Just a reminder to everyone, if you do type them into everyone, that way Jeanette will be able to see them as well as me. Someone is wondering if
there's a little drop-down menu that you select, and then you move it up to everyone.
Yes. Mario Yanez from Earth Learning. Is that the?
Yes. Yes, thank you very much.
Yes, that was Daniel Ross. Thank you, Daniel. So any other questions for Jeanette? It's a lot of information coming in, but and we'll be sure to send you all the information so you can have it and digest it. And you know, we're happy to be resources afterwards. But if you have any questions now, we're happy to take them.
Did you say it was Daniel? I mean, they've used the tool themselves. I don't know if you want to come off mute and share any of your experiences with it. I didn't realize you were on the phone. Maybe not.
All right. Well, unless there's any other questions, I guess we will kind of feel free to type them as I'm talking, but I want to say a big thank you to Jeanette. I really appreciate you coming on and presenting this. You did so much work putting this together, and we're trying to really keep it moving forward with CFPs, so really appreciate you sort of being the bridge. And for all of the attendees, appreciate you being here, and I apologize for those technical difficulties at the beginning. And yeah, feel free to reach out with any questions, and I'll send the resources to you. So if someone's wondering who they can reach out for further assistance if their organization will try to use Whole Measures, and you can reach out to me, Mrs. Sarah, and if there's a specific question, I can connect with Jeanette. I'm not sure, Jeanette, how many questions you want coming your way, but I can certainly be a resource. I'm not as knowledgeable as Jeanette, but I can sort of be your initial point of contact for that. And Jeanette, feel free to add on there if you have other things. And I'll type my email address into the chat box right now.
And I just know, so Catherine is on as well, who was part of the Nuestras Raíces process. If you want to share anything, or Catherine, do you know of, are you doing consulting work around Whole Measures still? Do you know of others that are doing that? I think you can just unmute yourself if you want to share. She might not know how to do it. Let's see if I can find her name. I don't know. It doesn't have her name in terms of being able to unmute it. But it's great to have folks on the call who, I wasn't looking at the list, so it's really neat to see that there are folks on who have used the tool, and I would really encourage you, if you select the little X near your name, if you right-click it, it gives you the option to mute or unmute. So if you'd like to make a comment, you can go up there and unmute. Okay, I think they're not able to unmute at this point, but, oh wait.
Sure, yeah, so just a big thank you to all of you, and we really appreciate you being on here. And thank you, Jeanette.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you, Sam.